to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be seen. Before everything gets started, Marianne, I just wanted to say thank you very much for coordinating this Tisch over the last year. I really enjoyed it, and I very much appreciated it. It allowed me to keep a little busy and stay in touch with, see many of my friends in Fresno. So I do appreciate that.
Great.
Yeah, it's really important for all of us, frankly, because you know, Genesis chapter 2, it's not good for a person to be alone, right? And we all need some time alone, but not forever, right? Or to quote another ancient Jewish source, people who need people are the luckiest people.
Right. That's a vintage source, not an ancient.
That's indeed, right on, right on. And Barbara Streisand, I think, is only a year older than I am, so I really have to be careful about this. Okay.
I just saw that our 6 Points camp down there is going to be housed on AJU campus this summer.
Oh.
I don't know if you were aware of that or if that's on your radar.
No, what is the 6 Points?
So yeah, URJ has developed some specialty camps, and the one in Southern California that is continuing has focused on science, sci-tech, and they were supposed to be at Scripps, but Scripps gave them some hard problem, and I guess AJU at the last minute said, okay, yes, well, you can do it. So it'll be great to have a whole bunch of kids running around up there, hopefully well behaved and masked.
Is it we have a Mulholland campus where the university is, and then also the Brandeis Bardeen camp is, you know,
I assume I'm pretty sure it said Mulholland.
Oh, that Mulholland, okay.
Because it said dorms, it didn't say cabins.
Oh yes, yeah, that's Mulholland. Good.
Yeah.
These are teenagers primarily?
I think the lowest grades that go to SciTech are maybe like 9-10-year-olds on up into teen. I went to their campus a couple of years ago to see them in action, and it was just these are the science geeks. And rather than having one or two in a cabin of the social kids who you normally find at camp, it was all them. So it was like refuge for them. You know, like in LA, it's different than in Fresno, where one Jew comes in a room with a dozen others and it's like, oh, wow, I'm home. And so add upon that the science geek and then put them in a cabin or a setting of all relatively like-minded Jewish science geeks, and it's just a wonderful
paradise, huh?
It is it's great.
Double jeopardy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So we're right at noon, but I'm going to go ahead and give everyone a minute or two to join us today.
Marianne, I'm sad this is your, so to speak, swan song. I wish you would go on a little longer.
I'm opening opportunities for all of you.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
You've done a great job. It's been really interesting.
Yes, that's why we don't want her to stop. Nobody can match her.
Oh, hardly the case. You too can call anywhere your phone reaches. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today is our last Tisch, and we welcome today Rabbi Elliot Dorff. Many of you obtained his book or borrowed it. If you have a copy of a book that you borrowed, if you would just get it to Temple, that would be great, and I'll follow up with them there. Additionally, I just want to thank some of you who've contributed financially to today's program, and if you feel the urge, and you haven't done so already, just send a check to Temple and we'll take care of it. Thank you. Rabbi Dorff was here in Fresno about 10 years ago. Is that right, Rabbi Dorff?
I think so, something like that, yeah.
And he was the interfaith scholar in residence for a weekend that dealt with medical ethics and the way that it's viewed from the three main religious traditions that sponsor the Interfaith Scholar Weekend. But today we have a more specific question, and it's related to the issue of death with dignity. And last week I gave you just the basics of the death with dignity legislation that exists in California, talked a little bit about that history and how it came about. But if you read Rabbi Dorff's, the suggested chapters in Rabbi Dorff's book, you have a very different perspective. And I love the way he, in the writing, separates the American perspective from the Jewish perspective, at least at the time of the writing of the book. He did warn me that his ideas have changed. And Jack last week pushed me to speculate as to how Rabbi Dorff's ideas have changed, but now we can hear it, so to speak, from the horse's mouth.
All right.
Go ahead.
Very good. Okay. Just to sort of put this in perspective, just both for those of you who have been able to read the chapters and those who have not, picking up on what Marianne was talking about, as an American, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So as an American, I'm an individual with rights. The central Jewish story is Exodus Sinai, and then the trek to the promised land, right? We leave Egypt not as individuals, we leave Egypt as a community. And then when we get to Sinai, we don't get a single right. We get 613 commandments, right? I do a lot of interfaith work, and everyone, I mean, this last series of things I've done were for teachers in Catholic high schools, most of whom are themselves Catholic. And I tell them, you know, we get to Sinai, we get 613 commandments. That's the beginning of Jewish guilt. And they tell me, no, we've got guilt cornered. You don't know what guilt is. Whatever, okay. Now, sometimes rights and duties are reciprocal, right? So if I have a right to my property, you have a duty not to steal it. That kind of thing, right? But they're not always that way. My duties to my children are not the same as my duties to my parents. My duties to my country are not the same as the country's duties to me, right? And in any case, if I get up in the morning and I'm an individual with rights, then the world owes me, right? But if I get up in the morning and I'm a member of a community with duties, then I owe the world, right? So it's a whole different starting point in terms of how you understand yourself. And as American Jews, we balance these two parts of our identity throughout our lives. And let me just say, this is not in any way, shape, or form to disrespect the American side of us or the Jewish side of us. I think there are advantages to both and disadvantages to both. And we, as American Jews, get to, if we're smart, get to take advantage of the strengths of both of these pieces of our inheritance that we inherited, and to try to minimize the weaknesses in both sides. Now, when it comes to end of life issues, what that means is that from an American point of view, it would seem that I should be able to both take my own life and get assistance in doing so, and simply as a matter of right. And as a matter of fact, in the late 1990s, two appellate courts, the Ninth Circuit here in California and the Second Circuit in New York, both of them maintained that there was a constitutional right to get assistance in dying, right? To get aid in dying. In the Ninth Circuit, both of them based it on the 14th Amendment. The Ninth Circuit based it on the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment, right? That if I have the liberty, I have a liberty over my own body. This had already been established in the 1990 Nancy Cruzan decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, namely that as an adult, not true for children, but 18 or above, as an adult, I have a right to refuse all medical interventions. I don't have a right to demand them, all right, but I do have a right to refuse them. And the basic idea there is that I own my own body and therefore should be able to use my own body as I wish. That, by the way, was, of course, also part of Roe v. Wade back in 1973 in terms of the fetus as part of the woman's body until the fetus is viable outside the woman's body. And therefore, at that time, for the first 6 months before viability, the woman should be able to do with the fetus whatever she wants because it's her body. And therefore, she should be able to decide what she wants. That's the basic American side of it. The Supreme Court, in the Second District, ruled that on the basis of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, based upon the fact that if I have the right, which I do in every state of the union, if I have a right to commit suicide, and by the way, just as an aside here, you might say, well, of course I have a right to commit suicide, because if I commit suicide, what could the state do to me, right? Well, the truth of the matter is it could take away your inheritance, right? It could publicly shame the family. In other words, it's not as if the state doesn't have any recourse whatsoever to punish suicides, but no state does. I mean, if you try to commit suicide, they will probably try to stop you. In California, they can put you on a 72-hour hold to diagnose you as to see whether you're psychologically sane or not. But if you're determined to be psychologically sane, they have to release you, and you can go ahead and commit suicide, right? So the Second District, Second District of the federal court system said that if I have the right to commit suicide, then I should be able to have the equal protection of having assistance in suicide, right? In other words, it shouldn't be just if I'm able to kill myself, I should be able to do it. But if it's legal, then I should be able to get assistance in doing this legal act in the same sort of way that I get assistance in doing any other legal act, like using an accountant to pay my taxes, to figure out my taxes, right? That's certainly legal. Or I go to a doctor to help to help me, stay healthy, right? So if I can get assistance in other legal acts, why shouldn't I be able to get assistance in this as well? The Supreme Court, however, in 1999 ruled 9-0 that this was not a constitutional matter. This was a state matter. This was basically the U.S. Supreme Court saying, we don't want to get into these waters, right? And so it has been, ever since on the American side of it, a state issue. And as of last year, 8 states had already approved some form of aid in dying, California being one of them, and the District of Columbia. But that, of course, is a minority, of the states that have done so. And there are some countries who have done so, as well, Canada being one of them, and a few countries in Europe, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, right, have approved what used to be called assisted suicide, what I myself call assisted suicide, in a rabbinic ruling I wrote in 1997, but which I now call aid in dying, and for an important reason, because if you say assisted suicide, then what you're saying is that the person wants to kill him or herself, and is being assisted in doing that. But usually the kinds of cases, and there are such cases, right? There are such cases in which people really want to commit suicide. But there are a lot of the other cases, and the ones that actually were addressed by the California law, were people who have wanted to stay alive and have fought their diseases in some cases for years, maybe even decades, right? They want to stay alive, but their underlying disease is taking their life. And now what they want is not to have to live through the pain of the last, you name it, days, weeks, months, years of their disease taking their life, but rather to take their life more, more quickly and more painlessly. And so that's a very different kind of situation than an assisted suicide where there is no underlying disease that's taking the person's life, right? That's really the distinction, right? Where somebody who is in full physical health nevertheless wants to commit suicide. That's one kind of situation. That is assisted suicide. On the other hand, what is distinct from that is aid in dying, where the person is dying despite all efforts on that person's part to stay alive, and wants now aid in dying because the underlying disease is going to take that person's life despite all of these efforts to stay alive. And the point of it is to avoid pain and suffering. So there are 8 states that have done that, and the countries that I mentioned. And it's on the agenda for about another 20 states. Now, what they will do with that, of course, is anybody's guess. But the California passed its law in, it became effective on July 1st, 2016. And the Canadian law became effective about 2 weeks before that. And the population of California is roughly the same as the population of all of Canada. So it's sort of interesting to see how those 2 laws have fared in the almost 5 years now that they've been in effect. So what happened? So in order to evaluate these laws from a Jewish perspective, I have to go into, well, how does the Jewish tradition understand medical ethics to begin with, but especially in regard to dying? And those are the chapters I asked you to look at. By and large, the Jewish tradition is very pro-medicine. There's been a basic love affair between Jews and medicine for at least the last 1,500 years, 2,000 years. A lot of rabbis during the Middle Ages were also physicians. Probably the most famous of them was Maimonides, but there's a whole slew of them that were also physicians. And there still is the case that in some communities, when a rabbi is called to the Torah, you call that person by the name Harav so-and-so, the rabbi so-and-so. The only other profession that sometimes gets that honor is the doctor. Yamod Harofeh, made the doctor so-and-so be called to the Torah. So, I mean, the tradition really has a major, a very positive evaluation of doctors and of medicine. And it is largely very aggressive in trying to maintain life. One part of the tradition says, and this is in the Talmud, that you are supposed to violate, you may, and not only may, but must, violate every law in the Torah with the exception of 3 in order to be able to save a person's life. The 3 exceptions are murder, incest, adultery, it counts as 1, and idolatry. So if somebody comes up to me and says, either, gun in hand, right, and says, either kill that person or I will kill you, then you have to die rather than kill another person another obviously not in a war or something like that, but in other words, somebody that this assailant wants you to kill, right? So that's one of the three exceptions. But even those three exceptions in the later medieval and modern Jewish legal system have been narrowed a lot. So basically, pikuach nefesh, saving a person's life, takes precedence over almost all of the other commandments in the Torah. Okay, if you have to, it's late at night and somebody is on the street dying and you happen to be a physician and there's a pharmacy right there that's closed, you're supposed to break into the pharmacy, steal whatever you need in order to save that person's life. Right now, afterward, you've got to work out repayment and things like that. But at the moment, you're supposed to steal. You're supposed to, enter without license and steal whatever you need in order to save the person's life. That's just to give you one example of this. Okay, so pikuach nefesh is a really central piece of our tradition, and therefore it's not really surprising that Jews have been so involved in medicine, both on the clinical level and on the research level. Jews are, I think, rightfully proud of the number of Nobel Prize winners, including those in medicine, that have been Jewish. And that's not, that doesn't come by accident. That's part of the culture. So there are those within within the Jewish tradition that would say you're supposed to save life no matter what its quality, no matter what its potential for living, in the future. Whenever you can save a life, you're supposed to save a life. Now that's all fine until we got to modern medicine, because you see, you have to understand that this is the other background piece of information that you need to know. Until the 20th century, preventive medicine was fairly good. You have already in the Torah, chapters 13 and 14 of the book of Leviticus, you already have quarantine as a way of a method of stopping communicable diseases, right? And we of course have let me just get this. Okay, it's done. Good. We during this past pandemic, our current pandemic, right? We have seen what quarantine means and the need to be able to do that in order to stop the spread of communicable diseases. That already is in the Torah. The rabbis already understand that you should eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, not too much meat. The rabbis already understand that you need sleep. By the way, we Americans are the most sleep-deprived society in the world, and we suffer a lot for that in terms of overweight and cortisol levels and blood pressure levels and all of that. The rabbis already understood also that you need to exercise. Okay, so these preventive methods of maintaining your health were things that were pretty well known even in antiquity, and more during the Middle Ages. Curative medicine, though, was really not good at all. The only things that they could do were take some blood. The ancient Greeks knew that, or assumed that a lot of diseases were bloodborne, and so what they would do is there would be a bloodletter, right? That is somebody who would take a pint of blood. It turns out that doesn't cure any disease except one that my mother had, polycythemia. If you have too many red blood corpuscles, then still to this day, the way that they deal with it is take a pint of blood every once in a while. But that's the only disease for which that works. And the other thing was that they would do surgery, but if they did surgery up and bay, Some of you may remember, do you remember Dances with Wolves? Do you remember that movie? It got the Oscar for the best movie, I think, in 1990 or something. It's a good movie, but anyway, it takes place during the Civil War. And in the opening scene, Kevin Costner, who plays the lead role, is a soldier in the war who has a leg injury, and he's brought to sick bay. And they showed what they did during the Civil War. Then, they would get a number of people to hold the patient down. They would get the person drunk, that's anesthesia, and they would saw, right? And if the person did not die of loss of blood, the person would die very often of infections, because it's only around this time that a man by the name of Lister figured out that if physicians washed their hands between procedures, fewer patients died. Hence you get Listerine, named after him, right? And still to this day, staph infections, that's not STAFF, it's STAPH. Staph infections are, even before COVID, were major issues in hospitals, right? Because medical personnel did not wash their hands sufficiently between procedures, okay? But that's what all they could do until some modern things. You already have Jenner, in the late 1800s, came up with a smallpox vaccine, and that was really effective, right? In the early 1900s, you got some of the sulfa drugs, and then in 1938 you got 28, and then rediscovered in 1938. You got penicillin, but it was not widely available until the Second World War. But curative things, and that is definitely a major, it was called the wonder drugs, the antibiotics, and they are. My father had a brother who in the 1920s got pneumonia, got bronchitis, which turned into pneumonia, and he died. And I inherited that weakness in my bronchial tubes. So I've had bronchitis about 15 times in my life, and I'm still here because of antibiotics. So, they are really wonder drugs. We overuse them now. That's a whole other story, and they're losing their effectiveness. But but nevertheless, our ability to cure is much, much, much greater than our ancestors ever imagined. And that's even truer now in the last 50 years or so of medical development, when you have all kinds of things, including organ transplants, that would never have been possible until the advent of cyclosporine in 1981. It's a anti-immune drug, right? So it enables the person who gets an organ transplant to ensure that his or her immune system doesn't attack the organ as a foreign object, right? Because until the advent of cyclosporine in 1981, that's what would happen with transplants, right? Even some of you may remember the first heart transplant by Christian Barnard in South Africa in 1961, but that lasted about a week, right? And the only real transplants that worked were between identical twins. We already had kidney transplants in 1954 between identical twins. And you could only really do them for people who were exactly the same DNA, basically, until 1981. But now you have it. And the woman who helps us clean the house every Thursday just showed me a picture of her cousin who had a heart transplant 2 years ago, and is now standing with his extended family and doing the kinds of things that he wants to do. Right now, that's amazing. And I just had a Zoom conversation, because one of the things you want to do during this pandemic is reach out, and you can't touch them yet, although you can now touch your grandchildren. The CDC says you can hug them, right? But the point is, you do want to reach. You use Zoom for what it can do. It can help you reconnect with people. So last week I reconnected with an old camp friend of mine. I haven't seen him in 50 years. I'm 77. You don't have to guess. And you know, and he had a heart transplant 2 years ago, and alive and well and doing his things. He's got to be very careful about going out anywhere because his immune system is compromised when you have a transplant, right? But that's, I mean, that changes everything. And even more importantly, I mean, in the year 1900, life expectancy in this country was around 45. In the year 2000, it was 76, right? We went from 45 to 76 in 100 years. Most of that is not organ transplants. Most of that is public health measures. Things like you're taught to wash your hands before you eat and after you go to the bathroom. Things like indoor plumbing, right? Which, you know, which my wife and I had a conference in southern India. My wife accompanied me, and you see these open sewage pits with flies all over the place. And you sort of wonder why people are not sicker than they are. And this is before COVID, right? But indoor plumbing is a major reason why we live longer. Vaccinations, of course, for, you know, measles, mumps, rubella, for polio, for smallpox. I mean, for all of those kinds of things, and now thankfully for COVID, right? Vaccinations are another reason why we live much longer. Also, public education against smoking, for example, right? Or against obesity, or against alcohol abuse, right? Public education and public measures to do that. Those are the major reasons why we live much longer. Second most important reason is antibiotics, and third is things like organ transplants and things like that, just statistically. But given that, the question, and that's all wonderful, but it raises the old Kantian question. Immanuel Kant pointed out that when you cannot do something, then you never have to ask whether you should, because you can't. But when you can do something, then you do have to ask whether you should, because there are all kinds of things that you can do that you should not do, right? You can smoke, but you should not. You can abuse drugs or alcohol, but you should not. You can, and here comes my Achilles heel, you can eat a half a gallon of ice cream every night of the week. And if you're going to do it, it might as well be mint chocolate chip or cherry Garcia. That stuff is so good, but you should not. Okay. So the question then becomes, with all of this added ability that we have in medicine, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should use it all the time to its fullest, right? What that means is that we now have to engage in a very careful moral judgment as to when to use some of these new medical abilities and when not, right? And in the case of people who are dying, that becomes especially important. It's also important at the beginning of life. I mean, do you engage, if you're not able to have children in the old-fashioned way, do you engage in any of the infertility techniques that are now available, right? So, I mean, it's not only that, but it is, but this issue is very much in front and center at end-of-life issues. So, not surprisingly, given the advances in medicine, see, until the 20th century, if you asked the rabbi, should I do anything to keep a person alive? The answer would clearly be yes. And then the response would be, well, we can't. Okay. So yes, you should do anything you can to keep a person alive, but then you go to the doctors and the doctors would really have nothing in their armamentarium, that's the fancy word, nothing in their toolbox to be able to keep you alive, right? Now, psychosocial pieces of medical care were much better, frankly, than what we did, because where would you die? Until the middle of the 20th century, where would you die? Yeah, at home, you know, among family and friends and familiar surroundings. Now we put people in hospitals and hospices and so on, right? And you know, and that's frankly not nearly as good on the psychosocial level as what our grandparents did. Okay, but on the medical side of things, there are many things that doctors can do to keep people alive. Now, in many cases, that's a good thing, right? I would say in most cases, maybe even in 80 or 90% of the cases. It's a good thing that the doctors now have tools to keep you alive. But in some cases, not. And those are the cases in which people are suffering a lot, right? And it used to be, even to take something like antibiotics, it used to be that doctors would say that pneumonia was a dying person's best friend, right? Because if you got pneumonia, then you would die faster than and with much less pain and suffering than if you had to wait out whatever the underlying disease is, that the cancer or the heart disease or the kidney disease or whatever it was. Whatever, if you had to wait out that underlying disease, right? So pneumonia was a dying person's best friend. And now, some pneumonias at least we can cure. Is it always in the best interest of a patient to have the pneumonia cured? Answer no, right? And so we need to figure out now, in a way that we did not before, when it's in the best interest of the patient and when not. Now, back in the 1990s, I wrote a tshuva, rabbinic ruling for the Conservative Movements Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, the essence of which is in the chapters of that book, because I wrote it in the early 1990s and that book came out in 1998, which basically says that the welfare of the patient is the primary criterion for deciding what to do and what not to do. So if that means using life support to its fullest, by all means do that. If that means heart-lung machine, if it means kidney dialysis, if it means artificial nutrition hydration for a period of time, whatever it takes, it means surgery, whatever it takes to keep a person alive, if it's in the person's best interest, by all means do it. That's this aggressive Jewish, attitude toward medicine and toward keeping people alive. But if it's not in the person's best interest, then you may remove machines and medications. And I would say, unlike another colleague of mine in the conservative movement who wrote another rabbinic ruling on end-of-life issues, Rabbi Avram Reisner, wonderful guy. We're very good friends. We collaborated on a whole variety of things, right? But we just disagree. Friends can disagree, right? We just disagree on this issue. I would say you may even remove artificial nutrition and hydration. And Rabbi Reisner would say, no, you must. That you must maintain no matter what, right? And the difference between us is very simple. He sees it as the way it functions. It functions in place of food and liquids. And his point is that we all need food and liquids during our lifetime, throughout our lifetime. We don't need medicines or machines. So medicines and machines may be withheld or withdrawn, but artificial nutrition and hydration, if the person obviously cannot eat and drink normally, then artificial nutrition and hydration must be administered and may not be removed. That's his position. My position is that's certainly true for food and liquids in the normal way, but not true for artificial nutrition and hydration, because artificial nutrition and hydration, first of all, lacks a lot of the characteristics of normal food and water. It comes in the body through tubes, right? So it doesn't have taste, it doesn't have texture, it doesn't have any differences in temperature. So for me, artificial nutrition and hydration is like medicine. And like other forms of medicine, it may be withheld or withdrawn if it's in the interest of the patient. But I said, that was 1990. I wrote another tshuva in 1997 about assisted suicide, in which I said, and that also is in the book, right, that assisted suicide should not be allowed for several reasons. One, because the way that the Jewish tradition sees our bodies is that we don't own our bodies. God owns our body. We have our body on loan during our lifetime. It's as if you rented an apartment. You would have fair use of the apartment during your lease. And in the same way, we have fair use of our bodies during our lease on life, right? But you don't have the right to injure the apartment, to damage the apartment or to destroy it. And in the same sort of way, we do not have the right to eat that half a gallon of ice cream every night of the week. By the way, in American law, There's nothing to prevent me from doing that. I might be stupid. I would be stupid because I would gain 500 pounds in no time and all kinds of bad things would happen to me, including death. Okay. But from the American point of view, it's my business. In the Jewish tradition, I don't have a right to do that. And by the way, knowing what we know about smoking and alcohol abuse and opioid abuse, right? Knowing we know about that, as a Jew, I don't have a right to engage in those behaviors either, because I have a fiduciary duty to God to maintain my body. That is, God trusts me to take care of that God's property, which is my body, right? So I have a duty to take care of my life. And in the same sort of a way, I have a duty to make, I have a duty not to take it. I have a duty not to commit suicide in the Jewish tradition. Now, when Jews did it, officially, they should be buried outside the Jewish cemetery, but that never happened, right? Because rabbis would always say, well, the person was temporarily insane and therefore not in charge of his or her decisions and therefore would be buried within the cemetery. But now we're talking about something much more difficult. Namely, and by the way, why did I take that position in 1997? Number one, because we don't have the right to kill ourselves in Jewish law. Number two, there are all kinds of money makes everything really murky, right? Mom is dying. She doesn't want to squander the family fortune on fruitless and futile care, so she wants to die faster. She wants assistance in dying so that she can leave money for the kids, right? Or worse, the other way around. Mom is dying and is in slow death, and the kids don't want mom to take a long time to die because they want to inherit the family fortune and not have it squandered on mom's dying. Obviously true for dad as well. Obviously, right? Your insurance company, even if it's Medicare, even the government one, would be very happy to assist you in dying because it will cost them much less money than to give you long-term healthcare insurance. So money is a really messy part of all of this, right? In that it takes what might be originally a very pure motive, namely to reduce suffering, becomes something else completely when you think about the monetary issues involved. So that was a second reason that I gave in 1997 to prohibit assisted suicide. And the third reason I gave there, as you read in the book, was that sometimes people want to commit suicide because they are clinically depressed. But if that's the case, then, and by the way, Judaism takes mental health very seriously, right? But if that's the case, then the proper response to that is to deal with the depression. And you deal with the depression in some ways medically, sometimes it's serotonin levels in the brain, right? But sometimes it's just socially. I was on a book project on suicide. This is in 1990 or so, before the cocktail of drugs to help AIDS patients was discovered in 1996. And the editors of the book project brought all of us together first to talk about the project. And one of the people that we interviewed was a 36-year-old man who had AIDS. He had seen what some of his friends who had AIDS had gone through while they were dying. And so he went and bought himself a 22 caliber pistol in order to kill himself, right? And he thought he had loaded it and he clicked the trigger and it didn't go off. At that very moment, a friend of his stopped by and saw what this man was planning on doing. And this friend set up a 24/7 accompaniment for him so that he wouldn't do it. So now we're interviewing him, and the physical prognosis is the exact same as it was a month ago, right? Namely, he's going to die a really excruciating death. Okay, but we say to him, "Do you still want to commit suicide?" And he said, "Well, my friends don't want me to." And you need to understand that some suicides are not a function of serotonin levels. Some of them are a function of nobody seems to care whether I live or die, right? Because we are, back to Aristotle, social animals, or back to Genesis chapter 2, it's not good for people to live alone, right? And if people think that nobody cares, then people sometimes want to commit suicide for that reason. But then you have to respond to it appropriately, not by, and helping the person kill him or herself is not an appropriate way. So those were the reasons why I said no to assisted suicide back in 1997. And I got, I think, of the 25 members of the law committee, I got 23 of them or something to vote for it. So now, what I wrote a tshuva, which I'll send Marianne the link to it after we're done today. It's 45 pages long, so you may not want to read the whole thing. But now it's called Assisted Suicide / Aid in Dying Revisited. Now, why am I revisiting it altogether? First of all, because in 1997, with the exception of Oregon, and even then it wasn't in effect until the following year, with the exception of Oregon, it was not legal in any part of the United States. Okay, so it was just nothing to talk about. But second, so now it is legal in 8 states, including California, which has a large Jewish population, and Canada, which also has a large Jewish population. Okay, so now it's already, it's not off the table simply because the government says it's off the table. So that's one reason why I was looking at it again. Second is that it is the case. My daughter-in-law is an oncologist, and she tells me that most forms of pain, doctors are able to reduce so that they are manageable, sometimes at the cost of consciousness. As a matter of fact, fairly often at the cost of consciousness in the late stages of this, but still are able to reduce pain. However, she said, in the 15 years that she's been an oncologist, there were 3 cases that stick in her mind where people were screaming their way to death. And as a result of those cases, even though she as a doctor was trained to save life at all costs, right? She now is in favor of the California law and would participate in it in those kinds of cases. So that was what led me to start looking at our law, Canada's law, and the law in some others, and some other countries and some other states and some other countries that allow it. And what I ended up doing was writing a very narrow exception to what I had written in 1997, in it you'll see I compare California's law to Canada's law, because those are the 2 jurisdictions that have the largest number of Jews in which it has been approved, although New Jersey just approved it last August, I think it was, and that has a large number of Jews as well. But and Washington, D.C. has a certain number of Jews as well. But California has more than either of those. And so what I did was I compared Canada's law to this law. Canada is more liberal. In California, the person has to, you probably heard this last week, the person has to ask for aid in dying twice, separated by 2 weeks, right? And then orally, and then has to do it in writing, and has to have, notary or witnesses, whatever the law requires. And then 2 different physicians have to agree to participate in this, right? And agree, first of all, that it's appropriate and that they're willing to provide the drugs. And then the patient has to be both able and willing, well, willing clearly, the willing person's asking for it. The person has to be able to administer the drugs herself or himself, right? In Canada, Canada allows for physician-assisted aid in dying. So in Canada, the patient does not have to be in a state in which the patient can do it on his or her own. a physician may do this. So as a result, as you'll see in the rabbinic ruling I wrote, over the 4 years, now almost 5 years, that these laws have been in effect in those two jurisdictions, there have been considerably more cases where the law was used in Canada than there have been in California, right? And in the end, I opt for the California model rather than the Canadian model, even though some of the law committee thought that I should have gone with the Canadian model. In part because I'm opening this door just slightly. Because of the factors that I was worried about back in 1997, right? I really want to make sure that if this law is used, it's used only for those cases in which otherwise the patient would be screaming their way to death, right? I want to make sure that patients are getting whatever pain medication is available, and that doctors. See, that's another issue in America. Doctors sometimes are reticent to give that pain medication for fear that they'll lose their license, right? And one of the things that the California law did was that if doctors go through these protocols, they will not lose their license for doing so, right? But we live in an Anglo-American society still primarily, and that's the stiff upper lip and all of that kind of stuff. So doctors are very often reticent to give the kind of pain medications that's necessary, especially at the end of life. But what I argue for is, first of all, we need to enable people to get that kind of pain medication, right? Even to the point where that it's going to take that person's life. So, but that's a very narrow exception. Marianne, you're the person I should send this to, I assume, right? Yeah, I'll send you the link to that tshuva. So you can any of you that's interested can read it. All right, let me stop and take whatever questions you have. By the way, I am really an outlier on this. Most of the rabbis who have written about this would say nothing doing, you should not allow assisted suicide or aid in dying, none of it. Okay, so let me just tell you, fair warning here, the fact that I would even have this kind of narrow exception is, what shall I say, an outlier. Okay, questions, anything you'd like?
Questions? Sheila, go ahead.
You have to unmute yourself.
Hi. I agree with your giving people at least some option in a dire situation. But I would think if someone is so ill that they want to die and have throat cancer, esophageal cancer, something like that, they can't swallow, they can't talk, it seems to me they would need a doctor's assistance to administer the medication that they were taking. And that,
well, it depends upon the medication. You're right. If you have throat cancer or esophageal cancer, you can't swallow anything, right? But they can put a tube in you to deliver pain medication. As a matter of fact, usually pain medication is delivered through an IV of some sort or another, right? And then it's a question of putting your finger on a plug.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
To deliver it. Morphine is very often delivered that way, right? And morphine works by suppressing the respiratory system. So that's the other place where Rabbi Reisner and I disagree. Long before we get to the very end of life, if morphine is titrated, that is, you start with the least amount that you need in order to quell the person's pain, right? And then if the pain gets worse and you need more, so you give the person more. At some point, the amount of morphine that you need, the next amount of morphine that you need, may, in order to quell the pain, may also suffocate the person. So Rabbi Reisner would say, you may only give that amount of morphine that will not suffocate the person, right? And if that means that the person is in unrelievable pain, that's the way it is. Whereas I use the double effect argument. I say in my 1992 law that if you are giving the next amount of morphine in order to kill, with the intention of killing the person, you may not give the next amount of morphine. But if you are giving the next amount of morphine in order to quell the pain that cannot be quelled otherwise, then you may. That's called the double effect argument, depending upon what your intention is, even though you know it might have an effect that you don't intend, right? Now, of course, you may not give double the amount of morphine where you know it's going to kill the person. That you may not do, right? But you may give the next amount. So in the same, but now what the aid in dying is saying, that what I'm saying in the aid in dying tshuva is actually you may give the next amount of morphine that you know will kill the patient under these very clear, under these very limited circumstances.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And by the way, I mean, that is we just had a very good friend who died of esophageal cancer, and it is no picnic, to put it mildly. And bone cancer also, and pancreatic cancer can be very painful. Ironically, brain cancer is not. Brain cancer doesn't, I mean, it's wild, but people who suffer from brain cancer often die of it, because often, especially if it's in the inner parts of the brain, it can't be operated on, but they don't feel anything. It's really wild.
Mm.
Hannah,
Hannah,
you have a question?
How about something like ALS, where you're not necessarily in terrible pain, but you're also not able to self-administer.
Right.
But you decide, you know what a slow, long, terrible process that is before you die. So,
Yeah,
but if someone
right.
decides enough, what
Yeah,
happens?
I mean, you're raising a very good point. There are, ALS or MS or some of these other very debilitating diseases would not qualify under California's law, right? Or under my tshuva. And I am frankly troubled by the fact that that doesn't qualify under my tshuva, because those kinds of cases, especially again, toward the end, and we're talking about people who have fought those diseases often for decades, right? Before they just can't take it anymore. And they're just so debilitated at that point that they could not self-administer. So shouldn't, how about compassion here, right? Shouldn't there be a way for them to get assistance in dying? I was really tempted to go the Canadian route rather than the California route, precisely because of those kinds of cases. I didn't go that route for two reasons. One, because as it is, I'm opening up the door. It's very unpopular to open up this door in Jewish circles to begin with, right? Because of the Jewish underlying ethic of trying to save people's lives, no matter their quality, right? And I was frankly a little bit worried about it, truthfully, as to what extent will. So you start with, see, as usual, what happens in life, right? You start with the clear cases, right, where it seems to be obviously warranted, right? But then the next case comes, which is like those clear cases, but unlike them in certain ways. And then the next case comes, and then the question is, at what point does this become the Pandora's box that opens everything, right? That's the problem. And so if I at least was able to limit it to where they were not able to quell the pain, at least that's an objective standard, right? With people with ALS and people with muscular dystrophy and things like that, I mean, they are just in a lot of pain through a lot of their lives, right? And the question really becomes, so when is it appropriate, assuming that you would allow it for these kinds of debilitating diseases, when would you allow it, right? Would you allow it at age 10, at age 20, let's say 18, they become adults, right? And they now are legally adults, and should they have the right to say, look, I don't want to live this life, right? Or would you only do it when the doctors say, the person's not going to live very much longer. You get the point here, right? As soon as you allow it, then there are all kinds of ancillary questions that arise, and they get very sticky because life is that way. Life doesn't, I'm a conservative Jew. I'm in the middle, right? I don't think life is black and white. I think it's messy in the middle. Okay.
Do you have a sense of what percentage of the conservative community will actually pay attention to and adhere to the responsa?
Well, okay. So I mentioned to you that at the earlier, I'll send you the link for both of them if you want. The earlier one, I got overwhelming approval on the law committee, right? On this one, 9 voted in favor. You need a minimum of 6 to become an accepted position within the conservative movement. 9 voted in favor, 5 voted against, 2 abstained. This is not exactly overwhelming approval, okay? But nevertheless, I think what it does indicate is that a number of conservative rabbis, are facing these issues with either themselves or with their congregants, or maybe their family members, right? And understand that, and until this tshuva was adopted, the only answer was you need to apply whatever pain medication you can, and if it no longer works, then you just have to tolerate the fact that the person is going to scream his or her way to death. And what this is going to do is enable people to say, well, no, in those jurisdictions where it's legal, you can take advantage of the law if you're a Jew under these circumstances. I don't know whether that percentage of the law committee, 9 said yes, 5 said no, 2 abstained. Those are the people that happened to be at the meeting at the time. It's a 25 voting members, so minimal quorum is 13. So we had more than that, but and with COVID, it's amazing. All of the voting has been online, for the last year and a half. So in any case, I don't know whether that's representative of the conservative rabbinate generally. There's 1,700 or so members of the Rabbinical Assembly, which are the organization of conservative rabbis. I don't know whether that's representative of the Rabbinical Assembly as a whole, but I do think that as more states pass these kinds of laws, rabbis are going to be finding themselves counseling couples and trying to comfort couples. Members who are either who have themselves suffering with this or whose family members are suffering with this. And I think it's going to be a big learning curve, frankly, for rabbis to learn how to deal with these kinds of issues and help families deal with these kinds of issues. So part of really writing this tshuva was about, and I went through why it is 45 pages long. Although I must admit I have a reputation on the law committee for writing long tshuvot. So here's another one. But part of the reason why I went through all of it is frankly to have it used as an educational tool for rabbis.
Stan, did you have a question?
Is there?
These are, of course, the conservative views. Are you familiar with the Reform views? We're a Reform congregation. Do they vary a lot from, or do we get to pick and choose, or what is it?
Well, that's usually what happens in the Reform movement, although that's much too. That is not, I take it back, right? I just couldn't resist, right? I'm just kidding, okay? Just kidding. No, seriously, all kidding aside, there is a responsa committee of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, chaired now by Rabbi Mark Wachowski, who is a scholar of rabbinics at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Rabbi Rick, I don't know, have they dealt with this yet or not?
I really should have looked it up. I have not seen a recent response on this. Everything that you've said and everything that I've read in your material is right along the lines of everything that I'm familiar with from reform which pretty much coincided with traditional thinking. There was not a lot of straying from more traditionalist Jewish legalistic thought.
Yeah.
So I
By the way,
served-
for those of you who have never seen it, you go to, and if you forget this, Rabbi Rick will give you the website. It's www.ccARnet, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, www.ccarnet.org, and that will get you to the website of the Reform Rabbinate. And then there's a slot, there's a thing that you can click on there called Responsa, right? And on their website, you can see a lot of the response of the Reform movement. If you were not aware of the fact that there are indeed rabbinic rulings for the Reform movement, you can find them there. There's a long history of that, by the way. I mean, long, back to Solomon Freehoff in the 1950s and 60s, who was a rabbi of a congregation in Pittsburgh, and who really started this whole process of having Reform responsa. So, I mean, you know, just as Reformed Jews, you should know that part of what your movement stands for.
One of my favorite things to do is to study Reform responsa with the community. And so one of the possibilities as we wrap up this form of the Tisch, if people want to find some opportunities, I can supply some responsa and we can examine them. What's really beautiful about them is they go through the history of Jewish law to get to modernity, and then our responsa committee, which, as Rabbi Dorff said, is currently chaired by Rabbi Warshawski, makes a ruling which we may or may not follow. But knowing about it plays into what we do. As a congregational rabbi, what Rabbi Dorff has been saying has played into my work many, many, many times, because it's very common that I'm asked to be with a family at and during end-of-life decisions. And as well, I've served as a hospice chaplain, and I've served on a hospice ethics committee. Everything he said is very much in keeping with what we've done in Reform Judaism as well.
I just want to mention, while we're on the topic, I did search a bit and saw only responsa that were in the 90s. So I didn't see anything current. And I just want to remind those of you who are here that on the URJ website, there is a section about dealing with the dying, and it is a discussion format. So in the Reformed tradition, while highlighting the issues the same as Rabbi Dorff had brought up, it encourages congregants or members to have those same discussions, to consider those same points.
Good.
Go ahead, Helen.
Rabbi Dorff, first, thank you very much for this talk and for your writing. It's just really been so educational. I'm going back to a comment you made earlier about how an individual we can mitigate pain, but it may be at the price of consciousness.
Yeah.
And so what I'm wondering, I'm applying this to myself, that I know that the doctors can give me something that will help my pain, but I don't want to be unconscious. And they explain that I will not be able to know what's going on or hear family members or whatever. So I'm no longer connected emotionally, spiritually. You know, I'm just alive physically and not in pain.
Right.
And I could be in that position for a very long time until I eventually die from the disease.
Right.
So within your Shuva, I could not say, no, I don't want to be unconscious. I just want to end this now.
No, you have, as I see it anyway, right? You have the right to remain conscious in pain. In other words, that's a trade-off that a patient, I think, has a right to make, to decide. In other words, you can say, look, I just can't stand it anymore. Just put me out if I have to be put out in order to alleviate my pain. Or the patient can say, I'm willing to live with a certain amount of pain in order to retain consciousness because I want to be able to interact with my family, with other people, and so on, right? And truthfully, I mean, you're usually on a much lesser level, but there are all kinds of us, especially later in life, but some of us earlier in life that have pains of various sorts, in our, that are, arthritis or whatever, and we live with it, and we certainly don't want to lose consciousness over, over quelling that kind of pain. So in the same sort of a way, when the pain gets much worse, and again, by the way, this varies also with pain level, with pain tolerance, which varies a lot from one person to another. So I mean, it's but the direct answer to your question is no. The patient has a right, in my view, to decide to retain consciousness with whatever amount of pain that the person is experiencing that cannot be quelled, or to decide I just can't stand it, put me out.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Lynn, did you have a comment?
My question is about advance directives. It seems as if a person could put in their advance directive along with I don't want to be a vegetable and have extraordinary means to keep me on life support. I don't want to be in extreme pain and this is my conscious decision. Wouldn't that have impact on their medical care in their final days?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me thank you for reminding me about this. If you have not filled out an advance directive, please do.
Thank you for
Right?
saying that. Yes.
And the reason for doing that is not the American reason. Here we go back to that again, right? The American reason that California actually was the first state to pass this kind of legislation. It was back in 1973, Living Well legislation, as it was called at the time. And now all 50 states have it in one form or another. But the American reason to do it is so that even when you are unconscious, you can determine the course of your treatment. America, individual liberty, right to the end. The problem is that I've been on the ethics committee at UCLA Medical Center since the 1980s. It rarely works in that way, right? The only way in which it works that way is if there's nobody, there's no family member whatsoever, then it will work that way, right? Or the opposite possibility, where the family members are at odds with each other, and the physicians ultimately have to get a court order to follow the advance directive. Because what the physicians will really do is, when you die, you're not going to sue the physicians, right? But your family members might. So doctors don't want to spend time in a court, even if they're going to ultimately win. They're not trained for that. They don't get paid for that, right? And they feel very uncomfortable in legal settings. So what they will do is, if you're unconscious, they will ask your family members, what should we do? And they will do their very best to make sure that your family members come to some consensus as to what should happen in your medical care. And then they will do whatever your family says. So what you need to do, the reason why you need to fill it out, is a Jewish reason. Namely, what you should do is fill out the advance directive. And by the way, the Reform movement has one, the Conservative movement has one, the Orthodox movement has one, and then there's the California Medical Association that has one. Fill it out. And by the way, get help with filling it out by somebody who knows what these interventions are. After my father-in-law died, I had to help her make a decision to remove life support toward the end of his life. And my mother-in-law felt very guilty about that, even though it was the right decision for him. And so I decided, and he did not have an advance directive. So I said, oh, Mom, we need to fill out an advance directive. And we use the conservative one, which takes you through about 10, nobody knows how they're going to die, but takes you through about 10 common scenarios that people have to face in terms of what decisions they make. So I started out with the first one, and she said, well, I want everything. So I started out, okay, so here's the first one, and this is what it needs, right? This is what the doctors would do. And she said, oh, I wouldn't want that. And then the second thing, oh, I wouldn't want that. Turned out she didn't want any of it. Okay, so why did she say she wanted everything? Because this is a real worry, because she was afraid that unless she said that, she would be abandoned, right, by the medical personnel. And that is a real concern, right? But you don't want to say that you want these things when in fact you would not want these things. So get somebody who knows the medicine to help you with this. By the way, this might be a good synagogue program, right? Where you get a doctor to help everybody fill out their forms, a doctor describing what these various interventions are and what they entail. So when you make these decisions, you can make them intelligently, right? And then once you do it, make multiple copies of your advance directive. One for your primary care physician, one for your lawyer, and one for every member of your immediate family. And then call a family meeting. I actually know of a family who arranged a trip to Cancun for all of their adult children and their families on condition that on Tuesday afternoon, they would meet with the two of them. And on Tuesday afternoon, they handed out copies of their advance directives and went through them, because nobody likes to talk about death, let alone their own, right? But Jews know how to deal with the text, right? So you hand out the text, okay? And you go through, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. So that way, when in fact comes time for, for somebody other than yourself to make decisions about your medical care, let's say it's one of your children, that person can say, well, look, you were there when Mom and Dad told us what they wanted. I might want something different, but I'm just doing what Mom and Mom or Dad wanted. Why is that important? Because unfortunately, I have seen such cases when there's no advance directive. There are, let's say, 3 adult children. 2 of them are convinced by the doctors that it's appropriate to remove life support. One of them says nothing doing. And usually it's the one who had the worst relationship with Mom or Dad during their lifetime. I actually heard this case. A woman said, Mom and I did not get along in our lifetime, but in the end, I was there for her and you guys killed her. Ugh. That's what you want to avoid, right? So the reason why you want to fill out an advance directive is to make sure that if your children don't talk to each other after you die, at least it's not your fault. It's not this that's leading them to do that. But yes, what it would amount to is you may determine there that you want your organs to be used for transplant if they're usable. You may decide that you want a lot of intervention or less intervention. That's the point of an advance directive. That's exactly right. And it might mean also that you can also add to these things. You can say that if I am in excruciating pain, right, I want to, I either want to stay conscious, even if it means that I'm in a lot of pain, or you could say, I want you to quell the pain, even if it means that there is a good chance that it'll take my life.
Rabbi Dorff, I just can't thank you enough for joining us today, and really, with humor and with knowledge, just kind of broadening our world on this issue. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And
okay, may you all live a long, healthy life.
Oh, good God, yes. After this, indeed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye. And I'll send you the link.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you, Marianne.
Yes, thank you, Marianne, for doing this through a time when we all really needed something like this. And I'm sorry it's not continuing, because we would enjoy it further, as time goes on. but thank you.
Give us a little time to reset and we will have more adult educational and discussion opportunities. Absolutely. And if you guys want to explore Reform Responsa, it's fascinating, interesting. I'm happy to lead some discussions on that.
Thank you, guys, and thank you, Elliot, for being with us.
Sure, my pleasure. Okay.
Thanks
Take
again,
care.
Rabbi Dorff. Always a pleasure to study with you.
Likewise, Elliot, my pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Take
Bye
care,
now.
everyone.